Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking an absolutely fascinating, massive legal showdown. We're talking about a corporate giant going head-to-head with the overwhelming power of the government's revenue service. It's a story about big money, constitutional rights, and honestly, the very survival of a nation's economy. The case we're looking at is from the Constitutional Court of South Africa, Metcash Trading Limited versus the Commissioner for the South African Revenue Service. Let's just dive right into what happened. Over 265 million rand. That is the staggering tax bill handed down to Metcash. At the time, there were this massive wholesaler and liquor retailer turning over billions. Now, I want you to imagine receiving this assessment and being told, hey, you need to pay this almost immediately. What if you believed the tax man was just entirely wrong? You'd probably want your day in court to prove your innocence, right? Well, in this specific situation, the law essentially said, pay up first, and we can argue about it later. The terrifying question here is, how does a rule like that even exist in a modern democracy? So here is how we're going to untangle this massive legal knot. We'll start with the 265 million tax bill, look at the mechanics of VAT, explore the pay now, argue later rule, review the High Court's verdict, and finally, break down the Constitutional Court's decision.
Okay, Section 1, the $265 million tax bill, Metcash's nightmare.
Now, this conflict didn't just happen overnight. There were intermittent rumblings from the tax authorities about Metcash's VAT returns starting way back in mid-1996. There were meetings, lots of correspondence, ongoing investigations. But things finally came to a head in May of 1999, when the commissioner literally hand-delivered a massive 52-page notice to Metcash. The commissioner alleged that transactions Metcash had with 4 specific corporations were fictitious. Basically, the state claimed no goods were actually ever sold or delivered, which meant no input tax could be claimed. So they hit Metcash with a bill for the allegedly unpaid tax, plus a massive 100% penalty for evasion, plus another 10% penalty, plus interest. The whole shebang totaled over 265 million rand. And get this, Metcash was given barely a month to pay it or face immediate collection steps with absolutely no further notice. Moving on to Section 2, the mechanics of VAT, following the money. To really understand why the commissioner could act with such sudden, overwhelming force, we've kind of got to understand how this tax actually works. Unlike your standard income tax, VAT arises continuously in this multi-stage process. When a vendor buys goods, they pay VAT on that purchase. That is their input tax. Then, when they add value and sell those goods, they charge VAT to their customer, and that's their output tax. Periodically, the vendor just does the math. They take the output tax they collected, subtract the input tax they already paid, and hand the balance over to the revenue service. It is basically a continuous loop of self-assessment and predetermined periodic reporting. A really crucial concept to grasp here is that a VAT vendor is effectively an involuntary tax collector. Think about that. The whole system relies on these businesses acting as the state's tax collectors out on the ground. They're entrusted with calculating the tax, keeping proper records, and handing over the money on time. Now, this is a massive burden on businesses, for sure, but it's what ensures a steady stream of revenue for the country. However, because it heavily relies on the honesty of hundreds of thousands of vendors, the potential for fraud, like those fictitious transactions Metcash was accused of, is incredibly high. All right, Section 3, pay now, argue later, the core conflict. Let's look at Section 36, subsection 1 of the VAT Act. It states that the obligation to pay any tax, penalty, or interest shall not be suspended by an appeal unless the commissioner directs otherwise. In plain English, if the taxman issues an assessment, you have to pay it right then and there. Sure, you can formally object, you can appeal to a special tax court, but none of that stops the clock on your payment. The rule is quite literally pay now, argue later. If you win your appeal down the road, the state will absolutely refund you with interest. But in the meantime, they want the cash. So how exactly does this rule bump up against fundamental human rights? Well, Section 34 of the South African Constitution guarantees everyone the right to have legal disputes decided in a fair, public hearing before court. Metcash argued that forcing them to hand over 265 million rand before a court could even hear their side of the story was a massive violation of this right. I mean, it's a fair question. How can you have fair access to the courts if the state can just take your money first and force you to fight to get it back? Which brings us to Section 4, the High Court's verdict, a victory for the little guy?
Metcash filed an urgent application to block the commissioner. And you know what? The High Court judge actually agreed with them. She ruled that the relevant sections of the VAT Act absolutely infringed on the fundamental right of access to the courts. She relied on a previous constitutional court case that struck down laws allowing creditors to bypass courts and seize assets. Basically, the High Court viewed the VAT Act's collection process as a form of illegal self-help. It was like saying the taxman was acting as judge, jury, and executioner, explicitly excluding the powers of the courts of law regardless of the demands of justice. So she declared those provisions completely unconstitutional.
And now for Section 5. The Constitutional Court decides. The twist. Because this was a constitutional matter, that decision had to be confirmed by the highest court in the land. And when the Constitutional Court reviewed it, they completely flipped the narrative. See, the High Court thought the taxman was engaging in this rogue self-help by bypassing the courts entirely. But the Constitutional Court pointed out that this just wasn't true. Under the VAT Act, if a taxpayer doesn't pay, the commissioner files a certified statement with the clerk of a competent court. That statement then acts as a civil judgment. The really crucial difference here is that the taxman isn't out there seizing assets directly. They're actually utilizing the ordinary civil courts and standard execution processes. The Constitutional Court noted that while this process is for sure a shortcut, it doesn't oust the jurisdiction of the courts. In fact, taxpayers can still seek judicial review if the commissioner acts irrationally in refusing to suspend the payment. To really ground its reality check, the Constitutional Court looked at the hard data. They noted that while VAT spreads the tax base wide, it places a massive burden on the revenue authorities to actually police it. Just look at these stats provided by the commissioner at the time. Out of nearly 20,000 field audits conducted over a period of just 6 months, irregularities were found in 38.5% of the cases. That involved over 688 million rand. To put that in perspective, almost 40% of those audits showed issues. The state is dealing with a notorious magnet for crooks and a remarkably high rate of tax evasion. The fiscus is incredibly burdened, they're understaffed, and they absolutely need strong tools to ensure the country doesn't just go bankrupt. So even if that pay now, argue later rule was seen as a temporary limitation on the right to access the courts, the Constitutional Court held that it was totally justifiable under the Constitution's limitation clause, and here is why. First, it prevents taxpayers from filing totally frivolous objections just to delay paying up. Second, it ensures a steady, predictable stream of revenue that the state literally desperately needs to function. Third, the court noted this exact principle is adopted in many open and democratic societies all over the globe, from the US to Australia. And finally, the rule isn't absolute, right? The commissioner has the administrative discretion to grant extensions or suspend payment if it's truly justified, and that discretion itself can be reviewed by a court.
So the final verdict was clear. The Constitutional Court declined to confirm the High Court's order of invalidity, meaning the pay now, argue later rule stands. The court found that the law provides ample opportunity for fair judicial determination in due course through the special tax court. It doesn't constitute a complete bar to accessing the courts. At most, it temporarily obliges the taxpayer to pay up, subject to a full refund with interest if they eventually win their case. The simple reality is that the mechanics of a functioning government require this kind of power.
And this brings us to a really profound conclusion. The Metcash case perfectly illustrates this incredibly delicate balance between individual human rights and the very pragmatic machinery required to keep a country running. It forces us to ask a really tough question. When the taxman comes calling, does the state's survival outrank your day in court? It's a fascinating look at how the law protects the system, even when it feels incredibly harsh to the individual. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope you walk away with a much clearer understanding of the immense power and the reasoning behind it of the Revenue Service.